Hoy en Carta a la Carta vamos a enfocar el automóvil y el automovilismo desde una perspectiva diferente, desde la perspectiva de la economía. Y qué mejor que con nosotros está el doctor Paulo Mourão, PhD, todo un especialista en la parte economía en el mundo del automovilismo. Doctor Mourão, Estefanía Ferreira and Edgardo Ver greets you from Carta a la Carta, Radio La Red Mar del Plata. How are you?
I'm fine, and for me it is a great pleasure and a great honor to be here with you because you have done a great work on the previous episode, and so I am going to try to keep the level. But you are so gentle that I'm sure that we will be successful.
Oh, yes, I'm sure about this. First of all, what do you prefer, being a cook or a dinner? Because this is Carta a la Carta, so what's your favorite dish?
I think that if you are a cook, you always have to taste a dinner, and if you want to taste a good dinner, I think that you have to realize how the cook has been done. And so I think that there is a balance between the preference for a cook or for a dinner. But okay, I think that I have to make an option, and so I will answer that I will prefer to be a dinner. And so if I can, I suggest you the Portuguese good friend, the Portuguese famous dish, the codfish with potatoes.
Oh, nice, nice. And tasty for this time. Really, very tasty.
Yeah, it is a great.
Absolutely.
It is famous, and I will be very glad next time we meet together that we taste it.
Okay.
Right, we accept.
Yes.
Paulo, my question is, how did you get involved with Formula One, and who has been your idol since Portugal got very good drivers? I'm thinking about Felix da Costa, but how did you get into this world?
Yeah, you know that all the kids receive influences from parents, perhaps especially from the fathers on this love for motorsports. Nowadays there are a lot of human loving motorsports too, but during my childhood the Formula One races were broadcasting during our lunchtime, and so during our lunchtime, during our Sunday lunchtime, what is a very sacred period, I loved to watch the Formula One races with my father, and so then I discussed the races at school with my friends, with my colleagues, and so time after time, day after day, race after race, the love for Formula One was getting stronger, was getting clear, and of course after the love it came the love for researching, and I realized that there was few research about motorsports, about my field, the economics, and so I tried to join these two beloved worlds, the economics and the Formula One. Regarding Formula One drivers, of course there are very good Formula One drivers. I think that each one of us will have not only one, but let's say 3, 4, 5 Formula One drivers. One because his style, the other because his way of being at the social spaces. But if I have to mention one or two or three, I have to mention, of course, the charismatic Ayrton Senna. For Brazilian and for Portuguese, Ayrton Senna is still one of the best. Of course, I have already met the first Brazilian Formula One champion driver, Emerson Fittipaldi, and so I also have to mention Emerson Fittipaldi. But I have also to mention, for instance, Nigel Mansell. Nigel Mansell, I think that because his mustache, and I think that he was like my father, because my father also had a mustache, and so I kept that idea. And Nigel Mansell was something like nowadays Verstappen. Because he took the risk, and I think that for us who are watching a Formula One race, or who were watching a Formula One race, we of course we want to watch a safe race, but we also love the risk takers, and Nigel Mansell as Verstappen, they are risk takers, and so I also have to mention them. And of course, Lewis Hamilton is a wonderful driver. Nico Rosberg, I love the style of racing of Nico Rosberg, but I think that it is hard to not mention some of the famous and so on.
Okay. And now we are talking about your book. We can see the face of that, the economics of motorsport, the case of Formula One, and it's the topic of today. And which period do you cover in your book? Is my first questions about it.
Yeah, Stefania. The book covers the entire period of official Formula One races. So it discusses Formula One economics since the first race, which happened in the 1950. And so we can consider that it covers more than 70 years of Formula One races.
Wow, it's a huge work.
Yeah, it has been, and it is still a huge work, because I realized that it is unfinished, and I am very glad to see that there are a lot of quotes on books, there are a lot of quotes of the chapters, and this is very interesting even for a researcher, because he realized that there are a lot of other people also researching the same topic, and in the case the Formula One economics. And this is very important even for the Formula One industry, because it provides additional insights for this so important industry, for this so important sport. And so we expect that additional studies, additional researchers will make this industry stronger and more sustainable.
Okay. Wow.
Well, I have a question, because we know that, could you investigate if society, public, and the private sector benefited economically from the series, and the other way around, if the series benefited from these three parts of society?
That is a very good question, because I didn't want to be a spoiler, and so I would suggest to buy the book and to read the book. And at the end, I will be very glad to offer you an e-book version of the book to both of you. But without being spoiler, I think that as so huge sports as this is, because it is only happening because of huge amounts of investment. We are always talking about billions of dollars or euros if you sum the costs of all the teams participating at the championship. This is the constructors' costs, and of course, if you sum also the human capital investment of each driver and of each team's engineer, so we are, of course, talking about one of the most expensive sports in the world. And at the end, that question is very important, because when you have a race in Spain, or when you have a race in Portugal and in Mexico, or in the United States, the local promoters have to pay a fee, and that fee is not a cheap fee, it is expensive fee. And so it is usual that the local parliaments, the national parliaments, make that question. At the end, does it worse or does not it worse? And that is a fair question. Of course, I tried, and at the book you can check the expected values for a random race costs and for its revenues, and at the end I will state that it worsens. And so, considering the direct and indirect benefits, and even considering the tangible and not tangible costs, at the end it has more advantage to receive a raise than the parent costs that you have to pay at the end. But of course, this is always a dynamic issue, and nowadays we are considering, we economists, we are considering costs which are different and which are in an enlarging list than the costs previously considered, for instance, at the 60s or at the 70s, because at the time the environmental costs, the costs of impact in the environment were not so considered, and nowadays they are also considered. Even the societal costs you have also to consider, but of course you have also to consider the positive externalities of the motorsport industry. For instance, the development of the safety at our roads, because we have to realize that a safety issue which is being developed in the world of motorsports, in Formula 1, but also in MotoGP or in other motorsports, after a dozen of years, it will benefit our cars, our motorcycles, and at the end our citizens at the roads. And so there are, of course, huge amounts of costs, but there are also very important and positive externalities coming from these motorsports.
Wow. Oh, I'm thinking about Mar del Plata in the 48, 49, 50, in the last century, when we received the pre-Formula 1
Exactly.
drivers, and it's so important to think how Formula 1 benefit whole society, and with things that we minimize in our everyday. No, like you are mentioned, safety on everything. But safety, I think that is the best example that we can share. I'm a researcher too, so I must to ask you, which sources have you investigated to write your book?
Yeah, of course. And as I told you, I will be very glad to share with you the ebook version of it, for a cost reason. Otherwise, I would send you two printed copies of the book. But okay, perhaps at next time we meet presentially, we can have a different offer. Official sources, of course. This is a research book, so we can only work with official sources. And of course, I think that I have read, if not all the books already printed about motorsports, even the management of motorsports, of motorsport brands, and so on. I have read most of them for sure, and they have been also quoted on book, and they also support many of the discussions of book. And not only, of course, books about motorsport, but about economics, about microeconomics, about industrial economics, as you can realize, because I tried to write a book at my sabbatical year, which covered so huge dimension like the revenues of Formula One, the cost of Formula One, the societal net benefits or net costs of Formula One, but also the profiles of drivers in terms of professional survival, why some drivers can race 100 of races and the other only a few of races. And these are very important issues because Formula One is a very, as all of us realize, it is a very competitive world, and so it is very important even for ourselves, which are living and working in different competitive worlds, but to realize how these guys, and some of them also on shadows. It is very interesting because you have I won't say many, but you have a few of very interesting cases of Formula One racers racing in many seasons without having achievement at one point or one podium, and that is very interesting. And so I recurred to a lot of sources, and they are at the Bible.
Wow.
Well, you were talking that your book starts from the very beginning of Formula One, March the 13th, 1950, up to the present. Could you divide the history of Formula One in periods from the economic side?
Yeah, that is also a very interesting question because we have to define the dimension in which you have to divide the history of Formula One. If you want to divide, for instance, the Formula One considering the engines, of course you have very interesting engines till the 70s, but after the 70s, with the ascension of the turbo period, the engines completely changed. And after the 2000, with the environmentalist issues, the engines also have a different period because they have to control the emissions of greenhouse gas emissions. And so considering the engines, you can have these three periods. But for instance, considering the level of professionalization of the drivers, you also have different issues because till the 60s there were a lot of gentleman drivers, people with a good patronage, with good godfathers, with good private investors, perhaps the parents or even the godfathers, and they paid for the kid driving. And so there were many gentleman drivers, as they were called. But after the 70s and after the 80s, the situation changes, and so you needed to accumulate different drivers and racers license. And without those licenses, you cannot race at one race, because it is expected that you accumulate competence but also skills, and so that you will participate and you will contribute to a good race, and so you will not crash the car at the first curve and so on. And so you have a different pattern of cycles of structural brakes, if you can consider at the cycle of the Formula One drivers, for instance. And so, and nowadays there are some people arguing that we are living perhaps a new cycle because of the appearance of the electronic engines. And so we realize that there is a trend for changing the old engines for new ones, for more efficient ones, but for engines supported by a different source of energy. And so we can be living, and it is always very passionate to live those hard times, and we can live a challenging period for Formula One because of these issues. And perhaps at the future, at the second edition of the Economics of Motorsport, I can, with your contribution, state a different pattern of these cycles in the history of Formula One.
Oh, wow. Edgardo?
So I'm thinking about one huge change that happened in history of Formula One. I can see two huge changes. One, in 1968, with the introduction of tobacco, and then in the 2000, when tobacco was banned. Could you place that huge changes there? Because Formula One was something with tobacco, and it's something completely different without tobacco.
Yeah, and still before replying to the tobacco issue, I was also remember the safety cycle. I think that there is a very interesting doc on Netflix about the cycle in Formula One safety, and so I invite you to check it. And considering these cycles, you will also find that we can have 3 cycles of safety issues in Formula One. The first cycle till Niki Lauda crash and in Nürburgring. The second cycle till Imola, 93, and the third cycle nowadays. And it is interesting that in this last cycle, only the death of Giulio Bianchi has to be solved. And so it means that Formula One has become a much safer sport than in the previous. So there is a different perspective for also discussing the cycles in the history of Formula One. But now, going to the tobacco issue, because tobacco, and I discussed it at my section 3.2 at the book, the broadcasting issue and the sponsorship issue were always very important for Formula One industry. And I have done that analysis. I picked all of the Formula One teams or of the Formula One constructors during the entire period of Formula One, and I studied the most important investors and the most important sponsors and heads at each constructor. And you realize that till the 90s, the most competitive constructors were always funded or supported by the tobacco industry. And so when the tobacco industry, let's say, was slightly banned or cancelled, because we also have to say that the tobacco industry was never completely cancelled, so it always injected money and injected sponsorship into the Formula One economics by different strategies. As you realize, they use now the code bars, they use now the indirect sponsorship and the indirect advertisement, and so this was a very interesting issue in the Formula One industry and in the Formula One revenues. And it is very interesting that you mentioned that, because we can also discuss the Formula One cycles considering the revenues. And the revenue cycle is dependent on the Concord Agreement. The agreement signed by most of the important constructors for a long term. And so these agreements define not only the strategies of revenues, but also the prize money distribution among the constructors at the end of the World Championship of Constructors. And so it is interesting to discuss that issue, but once more, I don't want to be a spoiler, and so I invite you to firstly to read the book and then to have a second interview.
No, it's amazing, and I'm thinking as you are talking about, I'm thinking about cryptocurrency that it's nowadays entering into Formula One teams, and for example Google, but in the main case of McLaren.
Yeah, it is a new brave world. It is a new brave world. Completely agree with you, Stephanie.
Yes, absolutely, and that's takes me to another place, and is from your study, from your economic study, you can reach, or you can spy or something like that. What's the age of the regular Formula One fan nowadays?
There are some studies about that, and they state that the average value depends on each country and on each period. For instance, there were younger fans at the 80s and at the 90s, because usually Formula One was broadcasted in an open channel, and so you were having to pay to watch it. Nowadays it is different, and so you have to pay for it. And of course, this is a kind of barrier to some kind of fans, not so foreign, with not so significant endowment, perhaps from families from middle or lower middle class, and so they are not able to watch regular races. But of course, nowadays you can have the internet at the coffee lunch, at the schools, and you can follow it. And as I told you, depending on each country and on each period, but because, and it is also studied, if you have a race in your country, you tend to follow the Formula One much more frequently than if you have not a race at your country. And so this is also important to keep audience. And so I think that Formula One organizers are nowadays realizing that they have a huge space, and I think that they have not done yet the full work for capturing the audience of younger people, of different income classes, but on average you have still beloved fans between the 20 and the 50s watching regularly Formula One races and discussing Formula One races independently of the championship has already started or has already ended. And so you have this kind of passion for Formula
One. Oh, you were talking about these fans, the new fans, how when you got a race in your country, it's like people get involved. When you got a driver from your country, people get involved. But Formula One, as you say, it is amid a brave new world. There are some other series around Formula One. Do you think that series such as Formula E or the new hyperdrives in WEC could be a challenge for Formula One?
Yeah, I think that they are a challenge, and some people say that they must be a more serious challenge for changing things in Formula One. I think these sports are still watched as the cheap relative of the family, as the poor relative of the family, and so as they are the poor relative of the family, they are not so attractive even in terms of sponsorship. But when they become more attractive, when they start to move or to get investment that usually went to Formula One and now or after some strategy, they go to these new sports. So I think that Formula One will face them thoroughly, and Formula One will have to significantly and structurally change, which nowadays it is not still happening. But I hope so, and for instance, I also appreciate WTCC, I also appreciate World Rally Championship, I also appreciate Motorsport at all, as I told you, the MotoGP, for instance, but still nowadays Formula One is the most expensive, is the most attractive, and it is the most expensive relative in the family. So perhaps at the future things will change, and at that time Formula One will also have to significantly change. But the law for racing, and especially the law for developing new engines with safer issues, will be always the core, let's say, the spirit of any motorsports. And Formula One, I think that will always have a special place in these issues.
Do you have any other question? Because for me, I'm absolutely satisfied with this menu brought by Paulo in economics and sports, because something that's not close to the vision of the people who sit and spend 2 or 3 hours watching a race.
Yes, exactly. I'm started thinking about it, so I appreciate all your ideas, and I think that it's the first of the for at least one more interview.
For sure, it will be a pleasure for myself, and I'm here. And even if someone at our audience will want to email me, please, you will just have to Google my name, Paulo Mourão, or Paulo Mourão at the University of Minho, that I will be very glad to reply, to answer. That is an ethical issue for every researcher, and I will be very glad to reply to them as I am replying to you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. We are going to share this information with our listeners, and really we want to appreciate this time, and you are going to be called again to be in front of Carta kitchen some other times too, to go on with this idea about economics of motorsport, the case of Formula One.
We can say that this race is not yet ended.
No, absolutely not.
For sure.
Thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.
Well, see you.